One, the silence he misunderstood. Have you ever mistaken someone's silence for patience, only to realize later it was the moment they quietly began letting you go? Because sometimes the loudest goodbye in a relationship is the one that is never spoken. If stories like this help you see relationships more clearly, consider subscribing to Hidden Angle Podcast, where we explore the quiet truths people rarely say out loud. Daniel Hayes used to think Claire Bennett was the easiest person in the world to love. She never argued. She rarely complained. And when he came home late, sometimes hours later than he promised, she didn't raise her voice or demand explanations. She would simply look up from whatever she was doing, offer a small smile, and say something gentle like, "Long day?" To Daniel, that felt like peace. In a world filled with conflict and expectations, Claire seemed effortless. His friends even said he was lucky. "You found one of the calm ones," one of them once joked over drinks. Most people would never tolerate that schedule. Daniel laughed and agreed. Because in his mind, Claire understood him. Or at least, that's what he believed. But there's something many people misunderstand about silence. From the outside, patience and loneliness can look exactly the same. Claire wasn't quiet because she was endlessly understanding. She was quiet because, over time, she had learned something painful. That asking for more didn't always mean receiving more. At first, she had tried. There had been small conversations, gentle requests, moments when she asked Daniel if they could spend more time together. Nothing dramatic, just small attempts to be seen. But Daniel always had a reasonable answer. Work was busy. The project was important. Things would slow down next month. And Claire believed him. At least, for a while. But slowly, something changed inside her. Not in one dramatic moment. Not in a fight. Just in the quiet accumulation of evenings spent alone, messages answered hours too late. Plans postponed again and again. So Claire adapted. She stopped asking certain questions. She stopped expecting certain things. And the strange part was, Daniel thought this meant everything was finally working. The house felt calmer. There were fewer emotional conversations. No tension. No arguments. What he didn't realize was that Claire's silence wasn't peace. It was distance. The kind that grows slowly. The kind that forms when someone learns that their feelings no longer have a place to land. And the most dangerous part of that kind of silence is this. It doesn't sound like anger. It doesn't even sound like sadness. It sounds like nothing at all. Which is exactly why Daniel never noticed the moment Claire quietly began leaving. Long before she ever walked out the door. To the woman who never demanded. Claire Bennett had a way of making her own needs look optional. Not because she didn't have them. Not because she didn't feel deeply. But because she had learned, quietly, over time, that asking could become humiliating when the answer was always delayed. So she stopped demanding. And the world rewarded her for it. People called her low maintenance. They said she was mature. They said she was understanding. Daniel heard those comments like compliments directed at him. He'd nod, almost proud, as if her silence proved he had chosen correctly. What no one saw was how carefully Claire built her days around not being a burden. She would cook dinner without texting. "When are you coming home?" She'd set a plate aside without saying, "I waited." If he walked in late, she didn't punish him with coldness. She smiled. Not a bright smile, more like a small surrender that made everything look normal. If Daniel forgot a date night, she didn't confront him with anger. She'd adjust the reservation, cancel politely, and tell him, "It's okay, next time." And she said it in a tone that made "next time" sound real. That was the most dangerous part. Claire didn't demand love the way most people do. Through conflict, urgency, or ultimatums. She demanded it through presence. And when she realized Daniel couldn't offer that, she didn't fight. She folded. Little by little. In ways that looked like grace. Daniel thought her calm meant security. But calm can also be a symptom. A person doesn't become quiet because they're happy. Sometimes they become quiet because they've finally accepted the truth they were trying not to see. Claire used to ask for small things. A walk after dinner. A Sunday morning with no emails. 5 minutes of eye contact that said, "I'm here." Daniel would agree, then his phone would light up. One call. One message. One, "I'll be right back." And Claire would watch him slip away. Again, without meaning to. At first she tried to bring him back with softness. Then she tried with humor. Then she tried with silence, because silence was the only language that didn't get interrupted. She stopped asking, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much to keep being ignored. And Daniel, without realizing it, started to enjoy the version of Claire who didn't demand anything. That version asked fewer questions. That version required less emotional labor. That version didn't mirror back his absence. It made his life easier. Which is why he never noticed the trade she was making. She was paying for peace with herself. She was shrinking her needs until they fit into the space he left behind. And when a woman learns to live without asking, she's already practicing how to live without you. 3 small moments that should have mattered. It wasn't the big things that slowly changed Claire. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't even a single dramatic argument that shattered everything at once. It was the small moments. The quiet ones that seemed too ordinary to remember. The kinds of moments people assume don't really matter. Like the night Claire cooked Daniel's favorite pasta after a long week. Nothing elaborate. Just a simple dinner, candles on the table, soft music in the background. She didn't say anything about it beforehand. She didn't want it to feel like pressure. She just hoped that when he walked through the door, he might notice. Daniel did notice. But only for a second. He kissed her on the cheek, loosened his tie, and said something quick like, "Smells great." Then his phone buzzed. 1 message turned into 3. 3 messages turned into a phone call. Claire watched the steam rise from the plates while Daniel stood near the window, speaking quietly about deadlines and numbers that meant nothing to her. By the time he sat down at the table, the pasta had already cooled. And Claire smiled the same gentle smile she always did. "It's still good," she said softly. And Daniel believed her. Moments like that happened often. Not dramatic enough to become a fight. Not painful enough to justify anger. Just small disappointments that quietly accumulated. Another night, Claire sat beside him on the couch while he scrolled through emails. She leaned slightly toward him, resting her head against his shoulder. Not asking for anything. Just being close. Daniel absent-mindedly shifted his position to reach his laptop. Not even noticing she had moved away. To him, it was nothing. To Claire, it was another invisible moment. The kind that slowly teaches someone an important lesson. That love isn't always lost in the loud moments. Sometimes it fades in the quiet spaces where attention used to live. Claire never made a scene about these things. She didn't keep score. She didn't repeat them later during arguments. Instead, she stored them somewhere deeper. A private archive of moments that should have mattered. Moments where eye contact could have changed the evening. Where 5 seconds of presence could have made someone feel chosen. But Daniel lived in a world where urgency always won. Another email. Another meeting. Another small distraction that seemed harmless. And because nothing exploded, he assumed nothing was breaking. But relationships rarely collapse in one visible moment. They erode. Slowly. Like a shoreline that loses sand with every quiet wave. And the dangerous part about erosion is that you don't see the damage while it's happening. You only notice it when the ground beneath you suddenly feels different. By then, the small moments that once could have repaired everything are already gone. And the silence between 2 people has quietly grown wide enough for someone to walk away. For the comfort of being unavailable. Daniel didn't think of himself as cold. In fact, if you asked him, he would say he was reliable. He provided. He showed up when it mattered. He kept his promises, at least the ones that could be measured. Bills paid on time. Plans booked. Problems solved. In his world, love was something you proved through stability. And emotional conversations? Those felt messy, unclear, endless. So Daniel learned to avoid them the way some people avoid bad weather. Not out of cruelty. Out of comfort. Because being unavailable had an advantage. It protected him from feeling things he didn't know how to hold. Whenever Claire's voice softened into that careful tone, the one that meant she wasn't accusing him, just reaching for him, Daniel's body would tense before he even understood why. He'd glance at his phone. He'd check the time. He'd suddenly remember something urgent. It was almost automatic. A reflex. Claire might say, "Can we talk for a minute?" And Daniel would hear, "I'm about to be asked to change." Not because she demanded it loudly, but because closeness always felt like a kind of test to him. And Daniel hated tests he couldn't control. So he did what he always did. He redirected. He offered solutions instead of presents. If Claire said she felt lonely, Daniel would suggest a weekend trip. If she said she missed him, he'd say, "Let's plan something soon." If she asked why he felt distant, he'd blame stress, workload, timing. All reasonable, all logical, and all just far enough from the real question. Because the real question wasn't about schedules. It was about whether Daniel could stay emotionally present when nothing else was distracting him. And that was the one thing he didn't know how to do. Some people think emotional unavailability is dramatic. Like shouting, like cruelty, like refusing to care. But most of the time, it's quieter. It's a person who never raises their voice, but also never truly arrives. Daniel would sit beside Claire on the couch, physically there, while his mind stayed somewhere else. He'd listen to her talk, nod at the right moments, then reach for his phone the second the conversation got tender. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He was trying to escape the vulnerability he didn't trust. Because in Daniel's past, feelings weren't safe. They were criticized, ignored, used against you. So he built a life where feelings could never corner him. Work became his armor. Busyness became his excuse. Distance became his comfort. And comfort can be addictive. Especially when it convinces you that you're fine. Claire could feel it. The way his attention slipped away. Right when she got close enough to touch the truth. The way his eyes looked at her. Without landing. And the cruelest part was that Daniel didn't even realize how safe he felt in that distance. Because when you've lived your whole life avoiding emotional closeness, availability doesn't feel like love. It feels like danger. And without noticing it, Daniel started to treat Claire's longing like a problem to manage, instead of a person to meet. 5. How love slowly becomes waiting. Love rarely turns into waiting overnight. It happens quietly. So quietly that the person inside it often doesn't realize what's changing until the pattern has already settled into their life. At the beginning, Claire never thought of herself as someone who waited. She had her own work, her own friends, her own rhythm of life. Daniel was simply someone she loved. Someone she believed she could build something steady with. In those early months, when Daniel ran late, it didn't feel painful. Life was busy for both of them. If he texted, "I'm running behind tonight," Claire would smile and reply, "No problem, see you later." Back then, later still meant together. But waiting begins in very small ways. A dinner pushed an hour later. A phone call promised but postponed. A plan moved from Friday to next week to some time that never quite arrives. None of these moments felt big enough to question. Each one had a reasonable explanation. Work was demanding. Deadlines were tight. Responsibilities came first. Claire understood all of that. Understanding was never the problem. The problem was what slowly grew in the space between those explanations. At some point, Claire realized she had started measuring her evenings differently. Not by what she was doing, but by whether Daniel might arrive. She'd finish her day and glance at the clock. 7 o'clock. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe tonight he'd come home earlier. Maybe tonight they'd actually talk the way they used to. And when 8 o'clock passed, she told herself not to be dramatic. When 9 o'clock passed, she told herself not to be needy. And when 10 o'clock passed, she told herself not to be disappointed. Because disappointment, repeated often enough, begins to feel embarrassing. So Claire adjusted her expectations. She stopped setting the table for two. She started eating earlier. Sometimes she would read, or watch something quietly, telling herself she was simply enjoying the evening. But a part of her attention remained open, like a door that never quite closed. Listening for the sound of Daniel's keys in the lock. Waiting changes the way love feels. At first, it feels hopeful, then patient, then careful. Eventually, it becomes something quieter. Not exactly sadness, more like a slow rearranging of the heart. A person who waits long enough begins to organize their emotions around absence. They learn not to hope too loudly, not to expect too clearly, not to speak the questions that might reveal how much they are still standing there. Claire never said the word waiting out loud, but her life had slowly started to revolve around it. And the cruelest part of waiting isn't the time that passes. It's the moment you realize the person you're waiting for never noticed you were standing there at all. 6. The day she stopped trying. The day Claire stopped trying didn't look dramatic. There was no argument, no slammed doors, no final speech about everything that had gone wrong. In fact, if someone had walked into the room that evening, they might have thought nothing unusual had happened at all. Daniel came home later than expected. Again. He loosened his tie, dropped his keys on the table, and gave Claire a quick smile from across the room. "Long day," he said. Claire nodded gently. "Yeah, I figured." Her voice was calm, almost peaceful. And that was the moment something had quietly changed. Because Claire had said those same words many times before. But before this day, they carried something underneath them. Hope. Hope that maybe tomorrow would be different. Hope that maybe the next conversation would land. Hope that maybe Daniel would finally hear the things she had been trying to say without pushing too hard. But that night, the hope wasn't there anymore. Claire wasn't angry. Anger requires energy. And she had already spent so much of hers trying to explain small feelings that always seemed to arrive at the wrong moment. Trying to find the right tone. Trying not to sound needy. Trying not to make Daniel feel pressured. Trying to make the relationship easier for both of them. At some point, she realized something quietly devastating. No matter how carefully she spoke, Daniel never truly heard what she meant. Not because he was cruel. Not because he wanted to hurt her. But because he wasn't listening for the kind of language her heart was speaking. So Claire stopped translating. She stopped adjusting her emotions into shapes that might fit more comfortably into Daniel's life. She stopped asking questions she already knew would drift away unanswered. It happened in subtle ways. She didn't mention the things she used to bring up. She didn't lean toward him when conversations paused. She didn't try to restart moments that had already slipped away. Daniel noticed the calm. At first, he thought it meant things were improving. The house felt quieter. There were fewer difficult conversations. Less emotional tension. And for someone who had always felt overwhelmed by feelings, that calm felt like relief. But the truth was something very different. Claire hadn't become more peaceful. She had simply stepped back. Emotionally. The effort she once put into reaching Daniel had quietly disappeared. And effort, once withdrawn, changes the entire atmosphere of a relationship. Because connection doesn't disappear all at once. It fades the moment one person realizes they are the only one still trying to hold it together. Claire didn't make an announcement. She didn't declare that she was done. She just stopped trying to move something that refused to move. And Daniel, standing safely inside the comfort of things being easier, never realized that what he was experiencing wasn't harmony. It was the beginning of absence. 7. The distance he didn't notice. After Claire stopped trying, something subtle happened. The relationship didn't explode. It didn't even feel worse at first. It felt quieter, lighter, almost easier. Daniel mistook that ease for progress. He didn't realize that effort had been the invisible thread holding everything together. And now that thread was gone. Claire still said good morning. She still asked if he'd eaten. She still remembered the small practical things that made life run smoothly. But the warmth inside those gestures had changed. They were no longer invitations. They were routines. A person can do all the right things and still be emotionally absent. Claire became that kind of absent. Not cold. Not cruel. Just slightly elsewhere. She started filling her evenings differently. She joined a yoga class after work. She stayed longer at a cafe with her laptop. She took walks alone with headphones in, moving through the neighborhood like someone practicing a new life. Daniel noticed the schedule changes, but not the meaning. He'd glance up and say, "You've been busy lately." Claire would respond with a soft, neutral, "Yeah, just trying something new." And Daniel would accept it. Because on the surface, nothing looked wrong. But distance doesn't announce itself with anger. It arrives like air. It slips into the space between sentences. Into the pause where a question used to be. Into the moment where someone would have reached for your hand. And now they don't. Claire stopped leaning into him on the couch. She stopped asking about his day in a way that required him to be honest. She stopped offering pieces of herself that might need to be held gently. Instead, she shared facts. Safe stories. Light details that didn't risk rejection. Daniel didn't notice the shift because it didn't inconvenience him. There were fewer emotional conversations. Fewer moments where he felt pressured to respond with something deeper than logic. In his mind, the relationship had finally become stable. But stability without intimacy is just quiet separation. And Claire was separating quietly. Even the way she looked at him changed. It wasn't angry. It wasn't resentful. It was softer than that. Like she was looking at someone she used to know. Like she was already remembering him while he was still standing right there. Sometimes Daniel would talk about something from work, excited for a moment, and Claire would nod politely. Her smile would appear, but it wouldn't reach her eyes. Daniel assumed she was tired. He assumed she was distracted. He never considered the possibility that she was emotionally stepping backward 1 inch at a time. Because to notice that, he would have had to notice her. Not her behavior. Her presence. And presence was something Daniel had never trained himself to measure. People like Daniel often confuse no complaints with no pain. They assume silence means everything is fine. But silence can also mean a person has stopped believing they'll be understood. And once that belief is gone, distance becomes effortless. Claire wasn't pulling away to punish him. She was pulling away to survive the loneliness of staying close to someone who wasn't really there. And Daniel, safe inside the comfort of things feeling easier, didn't see that the relationship wasn't improving. It was fading. Quietly. Right in front of him. The night everything looked normal. Some endings don't arrive with warning signs. They arrive on evenings that look completely ordinary. The night Claire decided something inside her had truly changed, looked exactly like any other night. The apartment was quiet. The soft hum of the refrigerator. The faint glow of the kitchen light. The distant sound of traffic outside the window. Nothing dramatic. Nothing broken. Daniel came home a little earlier than usual that evening. Not early enough to surprise anyone. But early enough to make the night feel slightly different. Claire was sitting at the table with a book open in front of her. She looked up when he walked in and offered the same gentle smile she had given him hundreds of times before. "Hey," she said softly. Daniel placed his bag down and stretched his shoulders. "Hey, long day." It was a familiar script. One they had repeated so often it required almost no thought. They ate dinner together. Nothing fancy. Just something simple Claire had prepared earlier. Daniel talked about a meeting that had gone well. Claire listened. She nodded in the right places. Asked a small follow-up question or two. From the outside, everything looked healthy. 2 people sharing a meal. 2 people speaking calmly. 2 people sitting close enough to touch. But something invisible had shifted. Daniel didn't notice the difference because the scene still followed the same structure it always had. But Claire felt it. The conversation moved across the table like a polite exchange between 2 strangers on a train. Friendly. Respectful. Carefully balanced. But not intimate. At one point, Daniel laughed at something he had just said. Claire smiled in response. But there was a small delay. Just half a second. The kind of delay that happens when a reaction has to be remembered instead of felt. After dinner they moved to the living room. Daniel scrolled through his phone while Claire sat beside him. Close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. And for a moment Daniel looked up and said something casual. "You've been quiet tonight." Claire turned toward him. Her expression was calm. Almost peaceful. "I'm just thinking," she said. Daniel nodded and returned to his phone. The moment passed easily. Too easily. Because what Daniel didn't realize was that Claire wasn't thinking about something small. She was noticing something final. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't hoping the night would turn into something deeper. She wasn't waiting for Daniel to look up and truly see her. She wasn't rehearsing the words she might say if the conversation opened. She was simply observing the moment, the way someone observes a memory forming. That realization didn't hurt the way it might have months earlier. It felt quieter than that. More like acceptance. Claire sat beside him for several minutes longer. Listening to the faint tapping of his phone screen. Watching the television light flicker across the room. And for the first time, she understood something with absolute clarity. The relationship hadn't ended tonight. It had ended slowly, long before this moment. Tonight was simply the first time everything looked normal. And she no longer felt the need to fix it. 9. The quiet goodbye. The morning Claire left didn't feel like a dramatic ending. There were no raised voices. No final confrontation. No moment where everything exploded into truth. It was quieter than that. The kind of quiet that settles into a room when something has already been decided. Daniel had left early for work. The way he usually did. A quick coffee. A distracted glance at his phone. A casual, "See you tonight." Claire had nodded from the kitchen. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would have warned him that this morning would not repeat itself again. After the door closed, the apartment returned to silence. Claire stood there for a moment longer than usual. Not because she was hesitating. But because she was noticing. The light through the window. The soft ticking of the wall clock. The ordinary stillness of a place that had once held so many expectations. She walked slowly through the apartment. Not searching for anything. Just acknowledging the small spaces where memories had quietly settled. The couch where she had waited during so many evenings. The kitchen table where conversations had once tried to reach somewhere deeper. The hallway where Daniel would pass by. Always moving a little too quickly toward the next thing. None of it made her angry. That was the surprising part. Months earlier, leaving would have felt like defeat. Now it felt like clarity. Claire didn't pack dramatically. Just a few bags. The essentials. Enough to begin somewhere else without turning the moment into a scene. Before leaving, she sat down for a moment at the kitchen table. Not to write a long explanation. Not to accuse. Not to relive every disappointment. Claire knew something important by then. When 2 people have stopped truly hearing each other, explanations rarely change anything. So she wrote something simple. A short note. Not cold. Not emotional. Just honest. She folded the paper and placed it where Daniel would see it. Then she looked around the room one last time. Not searching for regret. Just recognizing the chapter that was ending. There was a strange calm in that moment. The calm that comes when someone finally stops negotiating with a situation that cannot become what they hoped it would be. Claire picked up her bag and walked to the door. The same door Daniel had walked through thousands of times without thinking. She paused for half a second, not waiting for something to stop her. Just acknowledging that the life she had imagined here was no longer waiting on the other side. Then she stepped out, closed the door gently behind her. And somewhere across the city, Daniel continued his day exactly as usual. Meetings, emails, phone calls, completely unaware that the quiet he had grown comfortable with had finally spoken its last word. 10. Why some people cannot stay emotionally. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who said, "I don't care." That would have been too obvious. He cared in ways that felt safe. He cared by paying for things, by fixing problems, by showing up when something broke. But when the moment required him to stay, emotionally, quietly, without distraction, something in him would tighten, like a door locking from the inside. People assume emotional unavailability means a person is heartless. Most of the time, it means the opposite. It means someone learned early on that feelings were expensive, that expressing them created consequences. So they became skilled at surviving without them. Daniel grew up in a house where emotions weren't welcomed. Not the soft ones. Not the messy ones. Not the ones that asked for comfort. If he cried as a kid, he was told to toughen up. If he looked scared, he was teased for it. If he needed reassurance, he learned to swallow the need before anyone could see it. So Daniel became good at being fine. Even when he wasn't. Especially when he wasn't. He learned that the safest way to stay in control was to keep his inner world private. And that privacy slowly turned into a habit. A habit that looked like strength to the outside world. At work, it made him effective. He didn't panic. He didn't overreact. He stayed focused. People respected him for that. But what helped him succeed in public started to starve his relationships in private. Because emotional availability requires a kind of surrender. Not weakness, surrender. The willingness to be seen when you don't have a perfect answer. The willingness to sit inside someone else's feelings, without trying to solve them, dismiss them, or escape them. Daniel didn't know how. Not because he was trying to punish Claire, but because closeness triggered something old. When Claire asked, "Can we talk?" Daniel didn't just hear a question. His body heard danger. A future argument. A disappointment. A moment where he might fail as a partner. So his instincts reached for what he trusted, distance. He'd offer solutions. He'd change the subject. He'd become busy. Even kindness could become a way of avoiding intimacy. Let's plan a trip. Instead of, "I'm here. I'm tired." Instead of, "I'm scared. Not now." Instead of, "I don't know how to do this." And over time, those small evasions become a personality. Not because a person wants to be unavailable, but because being available was never modeled as safe. Some people can stay physically present and still emotionally disappear. They don't leave the room. They leave the moment. They leave the tenderness right when it arrives. Daniel wasn't refusing love. He was refusing the risk that love required. And when you refuse that risk long enough, you start to confuse numbness with peace. You tell yourself you're stable. You tell yourself you're practical. You tell yourself you're not dramatic like other people. But what you're really doing is building a life where no one can reach you. And the tragedy is this. By the time someone like Daniel realizes what they've been doing, the person who once tried to reach them has often already stopped. 11. The pattern he had never seen. For a long time, Daniel believed his past relationships had simply ended because people changed. Different priorities. Different paths. That was the explanation he repeated whenever someone asked what happened. And technically, it wasn't wrong. People do change. But what Daniel had never stopped to consider was something quieter. The possibility that the same ending had been repeating in different forms. After Claire left, the apartment felt strangely large. Not empty in a dramatic way, just wider. As if the silence had stretched into corners that had once been filled with her quiet presence. At first, Daniel tried to fill the space with routine. Work came first. Emails late into the night. A few dinners with friends who assumed he was simply busy, the way he had always been. He told them the same thing he told himself. It just didn't work out. And everyone nodded. Because that explanation sounded reasonable. But over the next few weeks, Daniel started noticing small things he had never paid attention to before. Moments that returned unexpectedly. Claire waiting quietly at the dinner table. Claire asking gentle questions he had answered with short replies. Claire leaning toward him on the couch while he looked down at his phone. Memories he had once dismissed as ordinary began to rearrange themselves. Not into accusations. Into patterns. Daniel remembered someone before Claire. A woman who had once said something similar during a late conversation. "You're here," she told him softly, "but sometimes it feels like you're somewhere else." At the time, Daniel had defended himself. He was working hard. He was building a future. Wasn't that what commitment looked like? But now, sitting alone in the quiet apartment, that sentence returned with a different weight. "You're here, but somewhere else." It echoed in his memory with uncomfortable clarity. And then another memory surfaced. A different relationship. Another evening. Another conversation that ended with the same confusing distance. Back then, Daniel had thought the problem was compatibility. Some people were just more emotional than he was. Some people wanted too much closeness. That explanation had protected him from asking a harder question. What if the problem wasn't the people he dated? What if the constant element in every ending was him? That realization didn't arrive like lightning. It arrived slowly. Like a shape emerging from fog. Daniel began to see something he had never noticed before. Every relationship had followed a similar rhythm. At the beginning, things felt easy. He was attentive, curious, present. But over time, when emotional closeness deepened, something inside him always stepped backward. Not intentionally. Almost instinctively. He became busier. More focused on work. Less available for the kinds of conversations that required vulnerability. And the person beside him, first confused, then patient, then quieter, would slowly adapt. Until one day they stopped reaching. Daniel had always believed those endings were sudden. But now he could see they had been unfolding for months. Maybe years. And the hardest part about seeing a pattern isn't the guilt. It's the awareness that the pattern had been there all along, waiting for you to notice. 12. The question that wouldn't leave him. After the pattern began to reveal itself, something changed inside Daniel. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone else could see. But quietly, like a thought that keeps returning long after the conversation that started it has ended. It began with a single question. A question that appeared late at night, when the apartment was too quiet and there was nothing left to distract him. Did she leave because I never truly stayed? At first, Daniel tried to dismiss the thought. People break up all the time. Relationships are complicated. No one is perfect. These explanations had always helped him move forward before. But this time, the question didn't disappear. It followed him into small moments. While pouring coffee in the morning. While sitting in traffic with the radio playing softly in the background. While answering emails he suddenly realized he had already read twice. Did she leave because I never truly stayed? Daniel began replaying ordinary scenes from memory. Not the dramatic ones. The quiet ones. Claire asking gently, "Can we talk for a minute?" Claire waiting a little longer before speaking again. Claire watching him with that patient expression that once felt comforting. At the time, Daniel had believed those moments meant everything was under control. Now they looked different. Now they looked like someone standing at a door, hoping it would open. And slowly realizing it wouldn't. The question grew heavier because Daniel started noticing something else. Claire hadn't been angry when she left. She hadn't tried to win the argument. She hadn't even demanded answers. She had simply stepped away. And that kind of leaving felt harder to understand than any fight. Because anger still means someone believes something can change. Silence, on the other hand, often means the belief is already gone. Daniel wondered how long Claire had been carrying that realization alone. How many evenings she had sat beside him, already understanding something he had not yet seen. How many quiet moments she had given him the opportunity to notice her. And how many times he had mistaken that opportunity for comfort. That thought unsettled him more than blame ever could. Because blame allows you to defend yourself. But a question like this doesn't accuse. It simply waits. Patiently. The way Claire once did. And the more Daniel tried to escape it, the clearer it became. Maybe the problem had never been whether he loved Claire. Maybe the problem was whether he knew how to remain present inside that love. Because loving someone from a distance can feel safe. You can care. You can provide. You can even believe you're doing the right things. But presence is different. Presence requires attention. Stillness. The willingness to stop running from moments that don't have clear solutions. Daniel realized something uncomfortable. All those times Claire had asked to talk. She might not have been asking for answers. She might have simply been asking him to stay. And that realization turned the question into something even harder to ignore. Because if the real request had always been that simple, then the distance between them had never been created by complexity. It had been created by absence. 13. What silence was really saying. Daniel used to think silence meant peace. No arguments. No tension. No dramatic scenes. To him, silence felt like the relationship was finally becoming easier. But now, after Claire was gone, silence sounded different. It sounded like all the words that never made it to the surface. Because Claire's silence had never been empty. It had been full. Full of small disappointments she didn't want to weaponize. Full of questions she didn't want to beg for answers to. Full of feelings she kept folding smaller and smaller so they wouldn't take up too much space in Daniel's life. At first, her silence had been kindness. She stayed quiet because she didn't want to start a fight. She chose gentle tones because she believed love could be protected by patience. She thought if she didn't pressure him, he would naturally come closer. But time teaches people things. And one of the hardest lessons time teaches is this. You can't love someone into emotional availability. You can only witness whether they choose it. Claire's silence shifted over months. It began as restraint. Then it became adaptation. Then it became something else entirely. Acceptance. Daniel remembered how she used to talk with her whole face. Her eyes would light up when she told him about her day. She'd laugh easily. She'd lean toward him without thinking. Then, gradually, her voice changed. Her sentences became shorter. Her questions became safer. Her laughter started sounding polite. Not because she didn't love him anymore, but because loving him had begun to cost her parts of herself. When a person is repeatedly unheard, they don't always get louder. Sometimes they get smaller. They learn to stop offering what keeps being dropped. They stop reaching for hands that don't reach back. They stop speaking in full sentences when the other person only hears the first half. Claire's silence was her nervous system protecting her. If she spoke too honestly, she would feel rejected. If she stayed too hopeful, she would feel foolish. So she chose the only option that allowed her to keep functioning. She stopped expecting. And what Daniel had called calm was actually that moment, the moment a person gives up the fantasy that something will finally change. That's why her silence felt so steady. Because it wasn't waiting anymore. It was mourning. Quietly. In real time. Daniel thought about the night everything looked normal. Claire sitting beside him, calm, composed, almost peaceful. He had interpreted it as maturity. Now he understood it as a final stage. A person doesn't leave the moment they walk out. They leave when they stop believing their presence matters. They leave when the hope dissolves. And what silence was really saying. In every dinner she ate alone. Every text she didn't send. Every feeling she swallowed was not, "I'm fine." It was something far more painful. It was, "I can't keep disappearing just to stay here." 14. The moment he finally understood. Daniel didn't understand the day Claire left. Not really. He read her note twice, then a third time, as if the meaning might change if he stared long enough. It wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't list his failures like a courtroom argument. It was simple. And that simplicity unsettled him more than any accusation could have. For days, he told himself she just needed space. That she'd cool off. That she'd come back once life felt less tense. Because in Daniel's mind, leaving was something people did in the heat of emotion. And Claire hadn't left in heat. She had left in calm. So Daniel kept moving, as if motion could undo reality. He went to work. He answered emails. He scheduled meetings. He told himself not to spiral. But the apartment kept reminding him. Her mug still in the cabinet. Her shampoo still in the shower. The quiet spot on the couch where she used to sit. Legs tucked under her, book in her lap. It wasn't the absence that finally broke through. It was a small, ordinary moment. One evening, Daniel came home with groceries. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and instinctively spoke, without thinking. "Hey, I'm back." The words fell into empty air. No response. No footsteps. No soft, "Hi," from the kitchen. Daniel stood there for a second too long, holding the grocery bag like it weighed more than it should. And in that pause, something in him finally recognized the truth. Claire wasn't going to answer. Not tonight. Not next week. Not after he finished the next project. Because she hadn't left to make a point. She had left because she had already been alone inside the relationship. And then it happened, the moment he finally understood. Not as an idea. As a feeling. He remembered all the times she had waited at the table with dinner cooling. All the times she had asked, "Are you coming home soon?" and then stopped asking. All the times she had leaned toward him, only to be met by the glow of his phone. Daniel had always assumed she was patient. But patience doesn't feel like this. This wasn't patience. This was endurance. This was someone quietly learning how to survive without being chosen. The realization hit him with a strange kind of grief. Not the grief of losing a person in one dramatic moment. The grief of realizing you let someone leave in pieces, while you called it normal. Daniel walked to the kitchen counter and placed the groceries down. His hands were steady, but his chest felt tight. He picked up his phone, out of habit, then stopped. For the first time, he didn't want distraction. He wanted to remember. Not to punish himself. But to finally see what he had been living inside. Claire hadn't needed him to be perfect. She had needed him to stay. To look up. To choose the moment over the next obligation. To treat her presence like something fragile and real. And Daniel finally understood the cruelest part. She didn't leave when she stopped loving him. She left when she stopped believing his love could include her. 15. The lesson hidden in her leaving. After Daniel finally understood, the apartment didn't just feel empty. It felt honest. Like the silence had stopped pretending to be peace. For the first time in years, Daniel began to notice how often he had confused comfort with connection. He had loved the calm. He had loved the lack of conflict. He had loved that Claire rarely demanded more than he was willing to give. But now he could see the cost of that calm. It wasn't harmony. It was Claire doing emotional labor alone. Holding disappointment quietly. Lowering her needs quietly. Swallowing words so the room would stay quiet. And Daniel had benefited from that quiet the way a person benefits from good lighting. Without realizing someone else is paying the bill. The lesson hidden in her leaving was not simply, "Don't take love for granted." It was sharper than that. It was, if someone must shrink to stay with you, love is already turning into loss. Daniel kept replaying the same truth from different angles. Claire hadn't asked for perfection. She hadn't asked for grand romance. She had asked for presence. The kind that is so small it seems effortless. Until you realize how rare it is. Presence is replying when it would be easier to disappear. Presence is looking up when your phone buzzes. Presence is staying in a conversation even when you don't know what to say. Daniel realized he had treated intimacy like an optional feature. Something he could offer when life was calm. Something he could postpone until he felt more ready. But intimacy doesn't wait for readiness. It requires choice. Daily. In small moments. The moments he used to dismiss. A dinner table. A paused sentence. A quiet, "Can we talk?" at the edge of the day. Daniel used to believe relationships ended because of big events. Cheating, betrayal, explosions. But Claire showed him a different kind of ending. The kind that happens when love becomes a long practice of waiting. When one person keeps making space, and the other keeps taking it. When silence becomes the main language because speaking feels pointless. And then one day, the person who has been waiting finally stops. Not out of anger. Out of self-respect. That was the part Daniel couldn't stop thinking about. Claire didn't leave to punish him. She left to protect something in herself that was disappearing. Her energy. Her softness. Her sense of being chosen. Daniel began to understand something else too. People don't always need you to love them more. They need you to love them in a way that includes them. Not around them. Not above them. Not in theory. But in the daily texture of being noticed. And once Daniel saw that, he couldn't unsee it. Because the lesson wasn't about Claire being the one who got away. It was about how many moments he had walked past while thinking he was still present. And the hardest truth was this. You can miss someone deeply, and still be the reason they finally had to leave. 16. The silence we all misread. There's a kind of silence we all misread. The silence that looks like maturity. The silence that looks like, "I'm fine." The silence that makes a relationship feel calm enough to ignore. Because loud pain is easy to notice. Quiet pain is the one we normalize. Daniel used to think Claire's silence meant she was strong. That she didn't need much. That she understood him better than anyone. But now he knew the truth. Her silence wasn't proof that everything was okay. It was proof she had stopped believing her feelings would land safely with him. That's what silence often means. Not peace. Not patience. But resignation. A person can love you deeply and still go quiet, not to punish you. Not to manipulate you, but because speaking begins to feel like touching a bruise. At first, they try. They choose gentle words. They soften their voice. They time their honesty so it won't overwhelm you. Then they realize they're always the one adjusting. Always the one translating their needs into something smaller. Always the one waiting for you to be ready. And the moment they stop trying to be understood, you think the relationship is improving. You call it less drama. You call it finally stable. But stability without emotional presence is just distance with good manners. That's why the most dangerous relationships aren't always the loud ones. They're the quiet ones. The ones where two people still share a home. But not a heart. The ones where the goodbye happens long before the door ever closes. If you've ever been the person who went quiet, you know this truth. Silence is rarely empty. It's full of unsent messages. Full of swallowed questions. Full of a love that kept getting folded smaller so it wouldn't be inconvenient. And if you've ever been the person who didn't notice, like Daniel, then you know the other truth. No one wakes up one day and decides to stop caring. They stop because caring started to hurt too much. Daniel finally understood that the relationship didn't end when Claire left. It ended when her hope dissolved. When she stopped believing that being honest would lead to closeness instead of distance. When she realized she could either keep shrinking, or she could leave and stay whole. That's the silence we all misread. The silence that isn't calm. It's closure. And maybe the hardest part is this. Sometimes we don't lose people because we didn't love them. We lose them because we didn't meet them. In the small moments where presence mattered most. If this story touched something in you, Please like this video so more people who need it can find it. And if you've ever misread someone's silence, or felt yourself going quiet, comment below. What do you think silence usually hides? Pain, patience, or goodbye? Share this with someone who keeps saying, "I'm fine," a little too softly. And subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more stories that tell the truth beneath the quiet.